Well, good morning, fam, and welcome to another episode of The Unpublic. We had a few technical difficulties this morning, so that got us off to a little bit of a late start, but I am excited. Today, my guest is going to be Karin Chenoweth, who is the writer in residence at the Education Trust. Karin is the author of multiple books, all of which I think you should go out and read because they are important for one. Well, they're important for many reasons. I was going to say they're important for one really particular reason to me, but they're important for many reasons. But if you are a person who wants to believe that children can succeed at all levels, regardless of their background, and if you're a person who believes that our systems that we have in place are the things that can make it happen, then there's probably no better person, no better researcher or author for you to tap into than Karin Chenoweth, because Karin's work, just the titles of her book, It's Being Done, it can be done is the essential message of her work. And her work isn't based on pie in the sky theories. It's not based upon observations and feel good notions of we just need to love kids and hug kids and that sort of thing. Her work is based on research of actually looking across the country and not studying failure as much as studying success. So looking for the places in the United States where schools are doing well and where students are doing well, and trying to get in the black box of why are they doing well. Understand more about what changes have they made to the way that they teach, to the way that they organize their schools and their districts and organize their school day. What they do for kids that actually makes a difference, because we know we can make a difference. Now, why is this important? This is obviously important because of the widespread belief that demography is destiny. That if I tell you what a child's background is, like if I tell you a little bit about their parents, tell you a little bit about their zip code, tell you a little bit about the neighborhood that they live in, that they grew up in, and some of their culture, then after that, I can predict with pretty good certainty how well they're doing in school. And because of that ability to be able to predict how well they're doing in school, it creates a truism. That truism is, if you have these characteristics, the story's over with. We can just move on. We know enough about you to be able to decide what the outcome's going to be. And if you left it to that kind of science, it's true. You really can predict with pretty good accuracy which kids are going to fail and which ones are going to succeed, until you can't. You can do that all the way up until the point where you say, okay, well, now let's study success. Let's study the kids that have all those markers, those cultural, demographic, economic, social, political markers, whatever you want to call them, and are still succeeding or doing better than the others. So for instance, let's say that you were to stop comparing Black students to white students, for instance, as kind of like a measurement of talking about the gap. If you were just looking at Black kids who all had the same backgrounds, then all of a sudden you wouldn't just be looking at a simple progression, you would be looking at a scatter plot, because kids would be doing all kinds of wildly different things in terms of their outcomes. So for instance, you might have same district, same set of schools with parents kids that have very similar parents, very similar backgrounds, and some are really exceeding and achieving for some reason and the others aren't. Now you can't blame it on just their demography, because they all have the same demography. So anyways, we're working on getting Karin in here. Like I said earlier, we had a couple of technical difficulties on being able to get her in to the show this morning, and even to get me into the show this morning. You guys, I always like to joke that COINTELPRO is real, and COINTELPRO is making it hard for me to be great. Previous books that we have talked about with Karin, I should say, she had a book called Schools That Succeed. She had one, Getting It Done, and one called It's Being Done. All of those books, love them because they all have a similar message. And I see Karin is in the back here. I'm going to bring her in a second. They all have a similar message, which is let's close the belief gap, because that's probably one of the most pernicious gaps in education. We talk about the opportunity gap, we talk about the achievement gap and all the other gaps, but the belief gap, to me, has always been the thing that has been the most important thing. It's the most important dragon to slay in education, because if you can get over the belief gap, it opens up a world of new data and information that you can look at to get on with the serious business of organizing schools that do well for kids. And look who is here. We got Karin Chenoweth. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That was a little confusing, but
No,
I'm
we
here.
had technical difficulties on our end, and I'm really so glad that you're here. Long time coming. Have wanted to talk to you forever. Have looked at your work from a distance. I think on a previous show I said, if there's such thing as the achievement gospels, there would have to be a book of Karin, because the achievement gospels to me is the good news. That's what gospel is supposed to be. Good news. That's what the good news is.
I bring the good news. Yes.
So bring me the good news. Like, if I were waking up and I was depressed and I was thinking, my God, there's just nothing we can do for these kids. The historical legacies of difference in race and economics is just forever. It's permanent. There's nothing we can do about it. These kids are just going to suffer. But that would be a depressing thought. That would be the bad news. And there would be a lot of people who could bring me evidence and proof to support the bad news, right? So I could sit in a room all day long and say, well, see, that's what science says. And then you come along.
Not proof. But,
okay, good.
But they could bring you data that would indicate.
They bring me, there you go. Correct me. So they could bring data that tells a good story for why I should keep believing that kids can achieve at high levels, and then enter you. And here you come with they're getting it done, it's being done, schools that succeed, totally different frame of reference of thinking. And now you have this new book about districts that succeed. So I think one good place to start, just with you to start, is this thing about that I'm saying right now about educational essentialism. Is it as dramatic as I'm saying that there's widespread what I believe to be scientific racism, to be very honest with you, but disbelief that it can be done or that it's being done. Am I overstating that, or do you think it's kind of a mixed bag? No, I see you shaking your head.
I don't think it is overstating it. I think, and one of the things I do in this book that I've never done before in my previous books is I try and unpack where that comes from. I mean, yes, you can say racism, clearly, but there's a history of how this happened that has nothing to do with, essential beliefs, but that has to do with the systematic undermining of the belief in democracy and the way public education works. And it started with, ironically, it started with the president who was who pushed for democracy the most in the 20th century. And that was President Lyndon Johnson. So President Lyndon Johnson, probably the most pro-democratic and a small d democratic president we had in the 20th century. He pushed, pulled, cajoled, intimidated, bullied the Congress to pass essential legislation that actually enforced the 14th Amendment. And, the Voting Rights Act, and other civil rights acts. And he believed very deeply in public education. He had been a teacher as a young man in Texas. He had taught in segregated schools, Mexican-American kids. He saw the result of severe under-resourced schools. And he was determined to both increase democracy and improve public schools for all kids. And those two things go together. They are not separate. They are together. And he knew, and so he pushed for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which established Title I, which sent boatloads of money to high poverty schools, because he knew that schools made kids smarter. He knew that. in his gut, he knew that. But he also knew he needed some intellectual, cover for that position. Just because he considered it self-evident did not mean other people considered it self-evident. So he basically commissioned a very renowned social scientist, James Coleman, and he said, go tell me what the effect of schools is. And James Coleman gathered a huge amount of data, the largest data set up to that point. And he found that indeed, as Johnson had predicted, African-American kids who grew up in poverty had fewer resources, fewer less resource schools, fewer science labs, fewer books, fewer libraries, fewer teachers, all the things you could count. And so that was of a piece with what Johnson had figured he would find. But he also found something else. When you controlled for all those factors, for books and teachers and so forth, there was still an effect that you could see, you could measure, that family background was highly correlated with academic achievement. And that was not what Johnson wanted to hear. So, in typical Johnson,
you had one job, James Coleman.
One job, and you didn't do it, right? Now, Coleman was actually a very serious social scientist, and he was working with the data he had. He wasn't working with all the data he needed. And he said, it seems like some schools have more of an effect than others, particularly for African-American kids, but that needs more research. Of course, all social scientists want more research. That's how every social science, paper ends. We need more research. And there were some other things that, he wasn't really, he was counting things you could count. He wasn't counting things you can't count, like quality of curriculum, stuff like that. So Johnson, in typical Johnson fashion, tried to bury the whole study. He released it, the Friday of a July 4th weekend, but it didn't work. That has become one of the most influential social science studies ever in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be some other, like contender, but it certainly is one of the most.
And in that study, let me just ask about this real quick, though. In that study, one of the most damning conclusions in it is that schools can do very little.
Well,
I think there's even
he didn't
isn't there a
actually
sentence
say
that?
that. I don't think he actually said that, but that was the implication that a lot of people took, and that they still take. I mean, George Will just had a column not that long ago, just a couple of years ago, where he basically said that and cited James Coleman, right? And so it's given ammunition to this idea that, well, schools can't do much, so why send more money down a rat hole, right? Like, I mean, that's the general, and there's just a lot of stuff behind that. So you can find endless numbers of studies that correlate student achievement with number of books in families' homes, or number of words mothers know, and I mean, just endless amount. So, but I am arguing in this book that it's time to revive a different line of research that emerged really very quickly after the Coleman report, and it was the effective schools studies, effective schools research, and the about at the same time, Sir Michael Rudder in the UK and Ronald Edmonds were working. So Michael Rudder isn't necessarily well known in the education field. He is a world-renowned psychiatrist. He's very well known for his work with Romanian orphanages after Ceausescu fell. He's just like enormously respected within the field of child psychiatry. He's not all that well known for education, but when he was a young man, before he was world famous and before he was Sir Michael Rudder, he got very interested in this Coleman report. And he was like, well, it's an interesting little observation that some schools have more of an effect than others. I wonder what that's about, right? And he investigated that, and he used the fact that London had done a very big study of thousands of kids, I think 12,000 kids, in a depressed and depressing part of London. And they had gathered huge amounts of information about father's job status, apparently not mother's job status, but this was in the 60s, but father's job status, grades, discipline, teacher observations, just a huge amount of information. And most of those kids went into 12 high schools. And I think of To Sir with Love as the picture of the high school. I have no idea if that's accurate or not, but that's the only high school in the 60s that I know of. And what he found was it mattered which high school you went to. Schools have the ability to make a difference. So he controlled for all kinds of factors, and he found that schools made a difference. And then and it was a whole team of researchers. They studied the schools that made a difference, and they emerged with a set of observations from those schools that it really made a difference who the principal was or head teacher. It really made a difference how collaborative the staff was. And these were like, you couldn't really take this wasn't a recipe for how to run a school, but you were able to really see that schools made a difference. Roughly at the same time, Ronald Edmonds. Am I doing too much research? I'm sorry. Is this what you wanted?
I don't think anybody can do too much research. This is the thing. The thing to me that's really important is to make a credible basis for people to understand that there is a science to doing better for kids. Like it's not fuzzy pie in the sky stuff. It isn't, oh, we just need to hug kids more. There's some very powerful narratives in education, which is money is the thing that matters, which it's hard to get into that argument because you go down that alley of money makes a difference. And you're either having to say, yes, it does or doesn't, and really in some ways it's like, of course, money matters in everything in a capitalist society, in a capitalist world. Of course, money matters to some things. And of course, we have evidence that shows that, with more money, sometimes you get better results, sometimes you don't. It's kind of a mixed bag, right? Like, so no, you're not doing too much research. And I think this genealogy of the research is kind of important too, because I don't think we do a good enough job of helping the public understand the pieces of the puzzle, how we got to where we're at. So, I mean, if I think you mentioned Coleman report, there's also the Monahan stuff. There's, also Nation at Risk type of stuff that, that came in the Reagan era. Then there were standards movements, and, you had Bill Clinton had a plan. George I had a plan. George II had a plan, right? So in each of these, there are different iterations. I'm glad you started with Lyndon Johnson and helped us see where we started. Now at Ronald Edmonds' Effective Schools movement, it seems like there was some other research at the same time. I don't know if it's the same thing. You could tell me if it's the same time. So Effective Schools was a set of research around the practices that can happen in schools that are highly correlated with schools that do better, even with the same kids that other people are failing with. And then you also had this body of work. What was the project that was the one that ended up saying that direct instruction was important? I think it was like
Project Follow Through.
Project Follow Through. Now, this is the biggest education research ever, right? Or
it was huge.
It was a mammoth
enormous
study.
Yes, okay. It was huge. But just to Ronald Edmonds, I was able to identify a set of schools, and one of the things he said was, what you do is you look for schools that have the outcomes you desire, and then you study them to try and figure out what it is they do to be effective. That is so straightforward a research agenda that it's almost childish, and yet it isn't done very much in this country, at least. It may be done more elsewhere, but that's not to say it's not done at all. But for the most part, what education research has been, and except for project follow-through, well, no, even project follow-through, has been these big correlational studies that don't answer the question why, or studies of individual programs, practices, or policies, right? So you've got this is basically the education research world, but then there's a little narrow strip of it that follows the Ronald Edmonds, dictum. Well, find schools that get the results you want, look at them, see what they do.
Why is that so rare, though? Why would that be rare as a line of research?
Who pays for it?
I mean, people who want to see, people who want to study how to make schools better. It seems to me like there's hundreds of millions of dollars over a period of time going into researching how to create better schools. So why would this be a niche strand of, it seems like
I don't know. This is what I've been doing for 15, 16 years, and I feel kind of lonely. I'd love more people doing it. And I think there are some graduate students I've heard tell of some dissertations being done. Now, I would say the main research that has gone on in this line has been out of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, which is incredibly detailed, rich, important. And how many people in the field of education really pay that much attention? I mean, very serious people do, and serious researchers do. They present at serious conferences and so forth, but it doesn't really reach the kind of national conversation about like charters versus not charters, money versus no money. Like the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research has been at this since 1988. They've studied schools that improve and schools that don't improve. And in 2010, they came out with their seminal work, which the core finding was the way schools are organized is much more important than individual practices. And this insight, it's right of a line with Rudder and Edmonds, and there is I don't mean to say nobody does this, but they're all of a piece, really. How school organization trumps individual practices, but so much of what I think could broadly be considered ed reform has focused on individual practices, programs, and policies. But none of them really, yeah.
So the way the school's organized is more important than individual practices. And when we think about what type of individual practices would we get lost on? Like, would we spend a lot of time thinking about when it's really something else? When we say practices, do we mean like the teaching in the classroom or how we induct teachers or monitor them or those things? That's less important than how we structure the actual school.
Right.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean to say individual practices are unimportant. Of course, they're important. But the way I put it, and this sounds a little insulting, so I hope I'm not insulting anybody. But so many of us think of schools the way kids do, or as parents of kids, right? Teachers are so important. They're so powerful. They're all powerful. So how they teach is so important. So there's been so much emphasis on, is that a good teacher, a bad teacher, a mediocre teacher? Huge, vast amounts of money were spent trying to sort that out, right? When in fact, from a school system point of view, teachers are actually not that powerful. They're very powerful for their students, of course. They withhold or impart knowledge, skill, sense of agency. I mean, they're enormously important within their classrooms. Nothing takes away from the power of teachers. But within a school, Within a school district,
Hmm.
your typical dysfunctional school and district, teachers are not very powerful. They don't have any say over the schedules, the budgeting, the programs, the school culture. They have control over their classroom. That's it. They're actually rather powerless within the
So
larger system.
this is a little countercultural, especially in all these debates that we have. So this is the Hanashek stuff around, if you have 2 years of a bad teacher, it sets you on a different trajectory than if you have 2 years of a good teacher, or the research around if you have a black teacher versus having a white teacher. So you're saying something different than that. Like,
I'm saying something different, which
yeah.
it's not actually like my kids have. I had plenty of bad teachers, and it did set me off on a
Mhm,
different
mhm,
trajectory. There's no
mhm,
question about that. But teachers are not good or bad within a vacuum.
mhm,
And
mhm,
I think we can get really distracted by that question.
mhm,
When I go to highly functional, highly effective schools and districts, I can talk to teachers who say, I wasn't a good teacher until I came here.
mhm,
That
mhm,
doesn't mean
mhm,
they weren't trying. That doesn't mean they weren't trying to be good teachers. That doesn't mean they weren't as good as they could be within the context within which they were. But once they're in a really functional school and district, they see how effective they can be, how successful they can be. It's a different experience.
mhm.
And so the school context and even the district context is really important. School context is probably the most important, but the district has ways to undermine and derail school effectiveness, and that's why I focus on districts in this book. Not because I
Yeah.
think districts are more important than schools, but they can either support or undermine school improvement, and they do.
So, the Edmonds research was around schools, how schools do better and how they organize themselves to do, great work. Some of your previous work used to highlight schools, which, I used to run and chase down exactly those schools because I'd be like, here's an example. Oh my God, this is all we need in the world. We just need examples of things that can be done. Like, I don't think until people see it, they won't believe it. I can remember you got me in a little bit of trouble because, you had these schools you would highlight. I would go out and look at the school, and then I would come back and write something about it. See, it can be done. It's being done. I wanted to scream to the world, like, and one of those schools, for instance, was George Hall. You've heard me talk about probably.
Did you go to George Hall?
I didn't actually go. I actually connected with the people, but I actually highlighted that example several times after you raised it because I dug in on it. I actually wanted to know more about it and find out, who did what and why was it successful, and was it some weird, wacky magnet school or some program that, that the district did and whatever. And I found none of that. I just found it was kind of a garden variety public school. Yeah, Southern public school where the educators had come together and just said, we're going to tighten up and we're going to and they made some changes, some personnel changes, some other stuff or whatnot. But the significant improvement that came after that couldn't be dismissed in my mind. But I put it out there, and the very fastest response I got was, well, let me check into these miracle schools, because every time I see one of these miracle schools, you probably know the person, Gary Rubenstein, he's a debunker of these good stories, these stories about districts and schools that succeed. And he's a math teacher, so he doesn't debunk it from some weird science. He debunks it as a mathematician who looks into the stats and everything, and he comes out.
Did he find something irregular in the stats?
He always does. He always comes out, and it'll either be about attrition, or funny business with the numbers, or numbers that look impressive but aren't really impressive.
And did he say something about George Hall? Was he able to?
He was. Now,
holes?
this has been a few years. I'm not going to be able to do his pushback justice. But this is my point: is that there are people in the world who believe that a lot of this is snake oil, that the numbers aren't really there. So that when we find an example, they treat it as like one of these miracle schools that'll be debunked at some point in the future. So anyways, I just wanted to put that out there in the world. Go ahead. You know, I don't know if you have something to say about that. So
I don't believe he found anything about George Hall. And the thing about schools is they are fluid. But if somebody went to George Hall in the middle, after what they call the transformation, I would have a hard time believing that they could look at that school and go, yeah, there's not really anything good going on here. Mm-hmm. I mean, you walk through and the kids are reading, they're writing, they're talking about important things. Now, after I wrote about George Hall, the district has changed the boundaries several times, partly because the housing project that it mostly served was getting raised, and I think it was part of one of those Hope 6 things. So they've changed the makeup of the school several times, and what that's done is it has meant that kids come in with interrupted schooling. They're going from kindergarten to second grade one place, and then they come into George Hall, and then they leave. So the George Hall hasn't been able to maintain quite where it was at the height. But that happens when school districts, kind of upend the population over and over and over. I mean, mm-hmm. like they're not miracles is the point. Mm-hmm. They're not miracles. What they are really, really thoughtful about what they need to do. And when you switch up the kids on them over and over, I mean, for a long time, that was a very, very steady population that came mostly out of a particular housing project. And let me tell you, the housing projects in Mobile, Alabama, they're not places that are,
they're not great places to
they're not. I mean, they look pretty much like warehouses. That's what they look like. Just physically, that's what they look like, and I suspect they feel like that on the inside as well.
So, in some ways, this proves your point, though. You just talked about a district that made a change that had an impact on a school that had done well. The educators had actually really put some thought and some heart into changing that school, made it better. And as a former school board member, I can tell you we can make decisions all the time about boundaries and curriculum and the way we're going to measure things that make a difference to great schools and make sometimes great schools not so bad. So you focus this time around on districts. And what's your aha and your thesis in looking into districts that do well?
So the reason I looked at districts was because of the George Hall example isn't really the worst. Things do happen. You have to change boundaries because housing projects change, and that wasn't such a terrible thing to do necessarily. But they also cut staff, which was a terrible thing to do. But there are some really terrible examples that have emerged through the years. One of the examples is M. Hall Stanton in Philadelphia, which Barbara Adderley was the leader there. 2001, it was one of the lowest performing schools in Philadelphia, which made it one of the lowest performing schools in Pennsylvania. By 2005, the kids were performing about at the average of the state, which was really quite an extraordinary turnaround. I forget the exact year. I think 2007, she took a job in the district as an assistant superintendent, the District of Columbia. And the district put in somebody who had put in their time, who had been an assistant principal for a while and wanted to be principal. So they put her in, and she dismantled every system Barbara had put in, the data systems and the student support systems and the collaborative systems. And the school deteriorated incredibly quickly, and it was closed a few years later. So this is a real example of a district actually undermining the school. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to find districts that were improving or high performing. So the problem with that is, how do you find them, right? Like, how do you do anything systematic? Because districts are so varied, 13,000 plus districts, different governance, different finances, different assessments, different demographic, like all of that. And then Sean Reardon at Stanford University kind of saved me from that. So he has spent years putting school districts on a common scale of socioeconomics and academic achievement. You can look at his scatter plot and go, oh, look at this little dot over here. Wonder what's going on there. And you can really just kind of I can lose myself. I lose myself in the data. Like,
this is your thing.
Oh, that's my thing. Like, what's going on in this place? I really want to find that out. So I also had to supplement with a lot of state data, because he's not capturing improvement over time or deterioration over time. And he's not capturing everything. So I had to really supplement his data with state report card data. But I came up with a set of districts that I had identified through the numbers and had, as Ronald Edmonds said, had outcomes that I wanted to see. And then I called them up. And some I had actually had some previous engagement with because of my work looking for individual schools. But some I had never, engaged with Valley Stream 30. So one of the questions I asked Sean Reardon was, where do African American students do the best in the country, no matter what the socioeconomic?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer actually was Wyoming, Ohio, which is a teeny little suburb of Cincinnati. It's a very wealthy little suburb, very few African American students. I started doing some, looking into Wyoming. It actually is doing some interesting things, but I decided it was just too little, too wealthy, too, whatever.
Yeah, very much an outlier, it sounds like.
Yeah, I just thought educators just aren't going to respond to it. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, where's the second? What's the second highest? And he said Valley Stream 30 in Nassau County, New York. Well, I had never focused on Valley Stream 30, but once you do, and you go look at the state report card data and all kinds of things, this is a district that needs to be paid attention to. And in fact, a doctoral student at Fordham University had thought the same thing. He had identified Valley Stream 30 in a different way, a different analysis, but had also identified it. And in his doctoral thesis, he wrote, "This is a story that must be told," just totally enthusiastic. And when I went to Valley Stream 30, what you see is system upon system upon system to help both ensure the coherence of the instruction of the students, but also to ensure that adults are continually learning, continually getting better at the job that they're doing. Mm-hmm. And the superintendent there is a longtime educator. He started as a high school business teacher many, many years ago. He's toward the near the end of his career. And at this point, he just makes it look easy, right? Like the real mark of an expert is to make what you're doing look easy.
How long has he been in the role?
He's only been in this role about five or 6 years, I think. He's been doing a lot of other things until he came to Valley Stream 30. And Valley Stream 30 was not a dysfunctional, horrendous district to begin with, but it's one of those white flight districts, right? I mean, it is Nassau County, which is one of the most segregated places in the country. And it's one of those near suburbs right outside Queens, where as African Americans, as Hispanics, as South Asians moved in, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews moved out. basically. There's a bunch of those suburbs around New York. And so it's got very few white kids, and it is really performing quite near the top of the state, and in like at all levels. Like the Hispanic kids are outperforming the white kids in the state. The Black kids are performing better than the white kids in the state. The kids from low income homes are performing better than the kids not from low income homes in the states.
So do you extract from
so
that
they're
story,
outperforming everybody?
when you look at a story like that, though, and you start calculating the number of things within the story that would make people elsewhere say, yeah, but I mean, how's that going to apply to my district? We are, we have this kind of dysfunction, or we have this kind of political system, or we have this, it's like it was, hard for Philly to look at that, and say, hey, we're Philly. We're going to look at this district, but we're going to erase all of our politics, our years and years and years of political
dysfunction.
Dysfunction. Right. Yeah.
Well, that's what through the years, I've been very careful to try and mix it up in terms of rural, suburban, urban, big, small. And so in part because educators have there is a tradition in education that is very particular, right? Like, I can't pay attention to you if you're not just like me. And you know what? You're never just like me. Like, one of it was amusing and dismaying at the same time, but a principal of a very middling achieving, but upper middle class school said, well, I can't really learn from the schools that you're profiling because I don't have enough poor kids. You just kind of go, really? If I had more poor kids, then I'd pay.
Yeah. So let's import some poor kids.
Right. Well, she wouldn't want that.
She wouldn't want that either. I bet.
But there is this tradition. If I have African American kids, I don't have Hispanic kids, so I can't pay attention to a Hispanic school. This is kind of nonsense because kids are kids, schools are schools, but that's one of the reasons I've been very careful to have a mix. So there's Valley Stream 30, which is a relatively small suburban township-based school district in the north, right? You want a big district that has improved enormously, that has gotten very little attention nationally. That's Chicago. You want to talk political dysfunction?
Yeah.
You want to talk political dysfunction, chronic under resourcing, chronic disrespect. The governor the last Republican governor a few years ago, like, just would dump on Chicago public schools all the time. Oh, they're no better than prisons. Well, actually, what's interesting is they're doing a lot better than they were 30 years ago. They've improved more than any large urban district in the country that I know of. I don't think you can. I mean, I'd be interested if somebody has a claim for another urban district that has improved more than Chicago.
I think people talk about Union City. Is it Union City, New Jersey? That's
possible. Union City has improved. I'm willing to, but that's a much smaller district. I mean, like of the big 100, great city schools, I think Chicago's it.
Yeah.
I'm willing to be open to look at other data because I haven't really done a study of that question, but Chicago has improved enormously. So on every measure, on high school graduation, it went from 57% graduation rate to about 82% graduation rate. Is that good enough? No, it's not good enough. Everybody should.
That's a big jump, though.
But that's a huge jump. That's a huge jump. Yeah. They've gone by 2015 on their state assessments, Illinois state assessments. Almost every demographic group in Chicago was outperforming its demographic group in the rest of Illinois. So white students were outperforming white students in Illinois. Black students were outperforming black students in Illinois. Still, like
So
a lot
attributable
of,
to what though? Why? Why
well,
were they doing better?
I have a whole chapter on this, and
Yeah.
it's a big, complicated story.
Mhm.
But essentially, the community, and if you go to Chicago and you talk to people involved, you feel this incredible focus on by the whole city, businesses, philanthropies, community organizations, parents, students. They've all sort of really thought about, how do you make schools better? And one of the ways you make schools better is by ensuring that they all have principals who know how to improve schools. I mean, that sounds so ridiculously, childishly silly, but principals were not thought of as school leaders. They were thought of as kind of interchangeable cogs in the bureaucracy that were really just there to implement district policy and protect the superintendent from angry parents. Like, that was the role of
petty business managers in some ways, just really business managers.
Sometimes business managers at the high school level, football, athletic directors, these were the important things for principals. It wasn't really thought, that wasn't really thought of as a role that improved student achievement. But we now have really good research that shows principals are the core of improving schools. And if you improve the recruitment, hiring, training, supervising of principals, you can improve student achievement. There was a really interesting study done by RAND of the 6 large school districts that the Wallace Foundation funded to build and improve their principal pipelines. And they did a study of what effect this had on student achievement. I thought it was too early. I thought they would not see student achievement gains so quickly. And even though it was too early, and really the gains should have been, I hope they redo the study in a few years, and I hope that they see bigger gains. They were able to document gains in reading and math in a fairly short amount of time. So improving the principal core really, really improves, gives the possibility of improving schools. So, and I didn't realize we could see comments.
Michelle Johnson says, let principals choose their staff, is what she says.
So what's interesting about this is I have seen that, and I have also seen principals work with staff. So George Hall, for example, since you raised George Hall, that was a complete transformation. The district brought in Terry Tomlinson and Debbie Bolden to be principal and assistant principal, and they let them choose their staff. And everybody had to reapply. If they didn't get a job back at George Hall, they got a job elsewhere in the district. So they weren't fired, but they had to reapply for their jobs at George Hall. And they only rehired a cafeteria person and a janitor.
Even though they could have rehired anybody that they wanted?
They could have rehired anybody, but this was a completely dysfunctional school. It had been, it was one of the lowest performing schools in Alabama, which, we're just going to stipulate that means one of the lowest performing schools in the country. And, they hired their own staff. I've seen other principals say, you know what, that's not how we need to be able to work with the teachers we have. We can't hire and fire our way out of this issue. We have to.
To that, I would say you've never really tried. But I mean, listen,
you go hire 4 million new teachers.
No. I mean, well, listen, that's kind of like saying, you go hire, 4 million new police officers. It's not going to happen right away or tomorrow, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to do some rehiring. I will say this, like, Bethune is a school in New Orleans that I highlight oftentimes that stayed a traditional public school after Katrina. And I've told this story a million times, just in that they didn't become a charter. They continued being a traditional New Orleans public school. Their principal had been a long-term a veteran public school educator and leader, and she knew what she was doing. When she came back after Katrina, she was able to choose her staff in a way, though, that she was never able to do before. And because she had been in the system so long, she knew who the star teachers were. So while everybody else was setting up charter schools and disrespecting the old educators, not remembering which ones were which, she was able to kind of handpick a team, like a star team of educators. That was her dream scenario. As a long-term New Orleans educator, her dream scenario was, number one, to not have the same system. To your point, the old system of the District of New Orleans Public Schools was so dysfunctional and corrupt the day before Katrina that the FBI had an office in the school district itself. That's how corrupt it was, and how poisonous. So you could have been a great educator in that system. You could have been a great principal and a great leader. The district system wasn't supporting your best work. After Katrina, she set up this little school, and no one paid attention because they were doing all these fancy things with charters and other kinds of schools. And she just plodded along with her little, school. And she got this set of great veteran Black educators from New Orleans, and outperformed. It was one of the only schools that was a traditional school that remained, that was outperforming the others. So
Bethune is one of my absolute favorite schools. I loved Bethune. And when I first called and I spoke with Mary Haynes Smith, the principal, who I just think the world of, I was a little, I come to schools with a lot of skepticism. I mean, so anyway, I said, well, you seem to be doing great work, and how do you do it? And she said, we love the children. And I didn't like that answer. And because I didn't like that answer because I had heard it before from educators I didn't think much of, because they stopped at loving the children, right? And so I didn't love the answer, but I said, well, can I come and look? And she said, yeah. And when I got there, I realized what she meant was, we love the children enough to teach them. And she did love the children, and it just shone through in that school. She is an amazing principal. I have to tell you, though, that 2 years ago, they did go charter. And they were forced to. They were forced to. It was the
last one. They were the last of the moment.
I think it was the last one.
Yeah.
But one of the incredible stories out of that. So it was a K-6 school. It went up through 6th grade. And every year she would see her kids go off to these junior high schools, and sometimes they did fine and sometimes they did not. And they were trying to navigate like this charter school system, which schools, and it was very complicated. And one year the 6th grade boys came to her and said, please add a 7th grade. And she was like, yeah, that's what I need. I need that in my life. Right? They prayed. They had prayer circles. They prayed. They said,
now don't get them in trouble now, Karen.
I mean, it was kids, right? It was kids. Yeah. They were not looking forward to going into kind of a difficult system that they weren't sure how. And they had seen their brothers and sisters and cousins, and and she added a 7th grade, and then she added an 8th grade to accommodate them. And it was really interesting how she talked with them about it. She was like, I'll do this, but you have to stay children.
Yeah.
Because I still have kindergartners in here, and I'm not going to have, semi grown-ups coming coming into this school, you have to stay children.
Yeah.
And I just love the way that, like that she talked with them about that. And I think they've done very well. She
This
was
is
very
like,
happy
though,
about it.
I like to highlight these stories, especially from Black education and Black educators, because they fit in this long line of Black education stories I care about. The Vanessa Siddle Walker work, I bring it up all the time because I think it's seminal. It's permanent. We should be paying attention to Black pedagogical practices, Black educational capital that we lost over time. And she strikes me as one of those Black leaders who is reminiscent of like a lot of the others I read from previous times. But
I think it's so appropriate. She teaches in a school named after Mary McLeod Bethune.
That's exactly my point. It's like this was called Bethune.
She leads.
And to your point about
school.
districts, though, your point about districts is you just kind of touched on a thing that drives me absolutely batty, though, was here I am. I'm a charter supporter. I support the chartering of schools. I don't support charter schools. I support the chartering of schools. That's two different things to me. So charter schools is a large set of schools that have some good, bad, ugly stuff going on, whatever. The chartering is a way in which I think educators can strike out on their own and start something like a George Hall if they wanted to. So when it came to Bethune, I think I was expected just to say, well, I think all schools should go charter, right? And I'm saying, why would you disrupt? Like Lucy Craft Laney, her school actually was disrupted by making it into a magnet. And that had a long history of Black pedagogical practices that was working well for Black students in that school. And then along comes desegregation and let's make it a magnet. And it was never the same again, right? Here's Bethune, let's make it a charter. There was no good reason for that district to make that school convert to a charter. They could have said, we have one or two traditional public schools that are showing what a traditional public school can do. But these decisions, districts make these decisions about boundaries, about structure, about staffing, budget, whatever, in ways. So you write a book about this in a lot of ways. And now we're coming up to time. But do you find anything in there that gives you hope that when you just said we can't fire our way to success, I wonder if we can make districts competent our way to success, meaning that the dysfunction of the superintendency being 3 to 5 years in a lot of places. I don't know how we solve that. It's like you come in, you make big promises, you fail at big promises, you shine up your resume, you move on to the next district.
Yeah, this is a disaster. That is just disastrous
and that's kind of a trend, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of there's a circuit of that. So how districts have, kind of temporary leaders at the top always. And then you have what you said, a soft principal core. And I don't know that anybody's figured out where great principles come from, for instance.
Well, we're starting to understand that.
You think we're getting there?
We're getting to that, I think. And I talk about that a lot in the chapter on Chicago and some of the other chapters. I think we are coming to understand how to develop, how to recruit, hire, develop principals who understand how to lead adults, which is really what we need, right? I think there is some good research, very solid research on that. If you have to look at the Wallace Foundation, but not very many people are doing that work. The Wallace Foundation.
Karen? Why?
Well, that is something I do not understand. It seems to me so. One of the most powerful questions in education is, your kids are doing better than mine. What are you doing? And what that does, you can ask that question at a classroom level, at a school level, at a district level, at a state level, at a country level. And what that question does is reveal a real professionalism, an ability to kind of take a step back and look at your work dispassionately, right? Because education is a very personal field, right? I teach Charlotte's Web because I love Charlotte's Web and I want the kids to love it as much as I do. Well, what did you want the kids to learn from Charlotte's Web?
To love it as much as I do.
How to use dialogue I'm going to teach them how to use dialogue in a narrative. Okay, so did they learn that? Well, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, but being able to step back and look at yourself, or all the kids in third grade take a quiz on how to multiply. My kids, only a few of them passed the quiz, but your kids, like 80% of them. Like, what are you doing? Can you come and teach that lesson in my class? Now, to get to that point takes a lot of work. You have to have common data. You have to have a common understanding of what kids need to learn roughly at the same time, a common understanding of how to assess it, a common time for me to be able to look at your data and my data in comparison and be able to go, your kids, your kindergarten kids know more letters than mine do. What are you doing? Right?
Let me ask you a question, Karin, because I know we're coming to time, but I want to ask you about this right now, because I keep asking, like, why wouldn't more people be interested in this information, this data? The question you just said the most powerful question you can ask in education is, your kids are doing better than mine. Why? Now, this gets us into some other territory, educational territory, but the reason that people push competition in education, for instance, rather than centrally planned education, is because if you don't have a motivation to ask that question, then you don't. And you don't have to ask or answer that question if you get the kids for free and there's no expectations, right? So entire systems can go years without having to ask, what are those guys doing over there? If there's no threat of any type of, there's no teeth in the system anywhere, why would you ask that question? Because probably what those guys are doing over there is more work than what you're doing.
Oh, it definitely is more work.
Right. It's
it definitely is more
so
work.
Who says I want to sign up for more work just because I want to solve a problem that I have no motivation to actually really sign? Listen, I want to come in, do my time, go home. Right. And do my,
I think there are educators who are like that. There's just no question. My kids had a bunch of them. Those people are broken down already. They've lost the verb.
The
People
fire.
don't go into education thinking that. They go into education thinking, I'm going to help kids. I'm going to teach kids. And then they get broken down by the systems that are breaking them down. I don't have enough books. I'm being asked to teach a reading program that is proven not to work. And yet, I'm being evaluated on that.
And yet we keep using it.
And yet we keep using it.
Yeah.
I'm being evaluated on stupid stuff, like, whether my desks are in a cluster or in rows, rather than on whether my kids are learning or not. Because as Ronald Edmonds said, to bring it back to Ronald Edmonds, kids are capable of learning in lots of different ways, which gives us a lot of different leeway for different instructional practices.
Yeah.
So there are ways that teachers are going to be, some teachers are going to teach better in rows. Some teachers are going to teach better in clusters. That's actually unimportant. The question is whether the kids are learning. Yeah. And it's the variations, and Tony Brick has done, a lot of work on this with the improvement science. It's in the variations that you're then able to find the ways that some people are doing better than others. And like, can I learn something from that? But it gets to what one of your favorite topics is, which is the belief.
Yeah.
You'll only do it if you believe that the kids are capable of learning. And if you don't believe that the kids are capable of learning, you're never going to do the work, because it's a lot of work.
And I believe that's a great place to land. It takes us back to the beginning. I think the belief gap is real, and it's probably the most pernicious problem within education right now. Like, if you don't believe that it can be done, you won't act on the belief that it can be done. But I don't think it's as simple as telling people believe. I don't think it's as simple as telling people it can be done. I think it's as simple as following your work and your line of logic, which is research it. Look at it. Ask the question, what you call the most powerful question. Some kids that are very similarly situated are doing better than others, right? So kid A and KB, why? Like, the most powerful question you can ask is, but why are they doing better
Right.
than this one?
Let me
And
go find
same
out.
neighborhood. Let me go find out, and let me bring receipts. Oh my God, we need receipts in these conversations so much. We need people showing up saying, no, I have a school you can go look at. I have a district you can go look at. So your work, what you are doing, I think is the answer that gets us out of a lot of fights. I don't know what we do besides just constantly keep beating that drum to get people to care to look over here. Like, hey, we see all that stuff you guys are arguing about over there, but maybe come over here because there's fewer arguments in the research around like some practical things that can happen within systems and classrooms and schools to make things better for kids. Maybe people at some point will tire of the other discussions and they'll enter the room with you and you won't be lonely. You said at the beginning of this show, I'm kind of lonely in this room. Maybe that won't be the case in the future. I want everybody to go out and get this book. I'm waiting for my copy. So, you know, if it seems like there's more, I have some questions that I'll have more questions after I get through this book once I get my copy. But I want everybody to go get it. We should actually be meditating together on it. We should be trading it with each other and trading the information. I kind of think it's our job to, if we really do believe, I do think it's our job to work with each other to kind of build up the fervor around the idea of we can make a difference. We can break the correlation between race, poverty, and achievement. As Karin's book says, that's the subtitle there, Districts That Succeed. I'm bringing it up. I'm showing you it on the screen right now where you can find it at Amazon. Karin, do you have a favorite bookseller besides Amazon that you would prefer me to tell people about?
I mean, you can also just go directly to Harvard Education Press. They sell retail.
There you go.
As well. Barnes and Noble, they sells it. I presume your local bookstore would order it. I don't know how many bookstores it's going to be in. I mean, thank you for sending people our way because I like to think it's an important book, and and anybody who has questions, feel free to tweet at me at Karin Chenoweth. On Twitter, or you can even email if you have a class, or I'm hoping to talk to education preparation programs and district leadership if they have any questions. You know, I try and answer them all in the book, but there will always be questions, and if you have questions, please let me know. Excellent. Well, every one of us that has connections to our local superintendent might want to give them a copy of Karin's book so that they can read it and they can follow up with Karin on these things. Karin Chenoweth, thank you so much. I really appreciate you for joining the show today. Thank you for having me. Thank everybody else for watching, for you giving me an hour and 7 minutes of your brunch time, your time between lunch and our breakfast and lunch. Really appreciate it anytime.